So we'll hang out a couple more minutes. While we're doing that, just want to introduce you guys to Brandon Washington. Brandon is the pastor of preaching and vision at Embassy Church in Denver, which sounds really familiar to the Embassy Church, the Hispanic church that meets at our facility, but two totally different places.
There's
And,
another Embassy Church in the Denver metro area.
well, it's Embassy in Spanish. I would totally butcher the name of it. It's like the Embassy for the Kingdom of God, but it's in Spanish. And so we've just gone, it's Embassy for us. And
Okay.
so yeah, it's a smaller Hispanic church that's been renting our facility for, I don't know, maybe a year or so, something like that. They meet typically under normal circumstances would meet right after we do on Sunday mornings. So yeah.
Okay.
Yep. But I can tell you simply on Brandon's reputation. I actually don't know Brandon. We have a lot of mutual friends, Scott Forrester and a couple other people like that. But simply on Brandon's reputation as a pastor, as a thinker, as a man of God, that I've heard his name come around town. I remember when he moved, hearing about him for the first time when he moved into town to start Embassy so many years ago. Yeah. I asked Brandon, I wanted Brandon to spend some time with us. Fortunately, Kwame had a hookup, knows Brandon personally. And so we were able to work some magic there to have him join us in this conversation with us today. And so I'm just glad he's here. I can tell you all kinds of cool things about Brandon. I mean, the man has a couple of degrees under his belt, theological degrees. He's on the board of Denver Seminary. He's written for this magazine. He's spoken at this place. But I think the most important thing you need to know about him is he is the husband of Carrie and two little ones, Reese and Ellis. And so he is their daddy. And that is probably his biggest life calling, if you will, to be their dad and to hang out with them and to watch them grow up. How old are your kids, Brandon?
My daughter is 10 and my son is 8.
Okay.
He's
Yeah.
8 going on 39.
Right.
We're working on that.
Yep. I totally understand and can relate to that. My kids are older than that, but yeah, still big for their britches. That's
yeah.
But let's see what time we got here. I want to keep a tight eye on the clock just for Brandon's sake, because this is probably bedtime for an 8 and a 10-year-old. And
I did get permission to be here, so you're fine. I'm not at home. I deliberately left home because I have an 8 and a 10-year-old, so I'm in my office right now. So, you know Scott Forrester.
Yeah. Scott and I, we met when I was the teaching pastor over at TNL and walked with him through the process of getting into Denver Seminary. And then I was his counseling mentor for finishing up his program over there. And unfortunately, he and Carrie picked the date for their wedding when I was going to be out of the country in North Africa. And so then you picked up the ball there, I think, and ran with it the rest of the way.
Yeah, we had a good time.
Yeah. So they're great folks. But yeah, just looking at your Facebook page, we probably know 10 or 15 of the same people. Now, Facebook, I don't know how deeply you actually know some of these people. If your page is like mine, but nonetheless, yeah. So let me check this chat thing going on here. Oh yeah, great, no big deal there. All right. So Brandon, why don't you, if you do a little favor, just kind of introduce yourself a little bit, kind of tell us who you are, give us a little bit of your story. That'd be fantastic.
Okay. You covered all the Denver hotspots. I moved to Denver. Actually moved here in 2004 for seminary, and after being here for a while, God made it clear that we were going to stay here, and he had to make that clear to my wife because he did me a favor because he told the two of us independent of one another, so I didn't have to go tell her. He did that for me. So that's significant because we're from Texas. I was born and raised in Dallas. My wife was born in Houston, and right around her 10th or 11th birthday, they moved to Dallas. And we attended the same church in Dallas, but it's so big that we didn't know.
Mm.
The church is about 12,000 people. It's a Texas thing. When you walk in, you're looking for the Foot Locker. It's that kind of church situation.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, yeah. I grew up in SoCal,
uh,
so I understand that with Saddleback
there
and
you
et
go.
cetera.
Yeah. So my pastor's Tony Evans, and his intern, his research assistant was a man named Icky Soma. Icky moved to San Antonio to plant a church, and he asked me to go with him. So I went to San Antonio to help him plant a church called All People's Bible Fellowship, where diversity was one of the values. In fact, Icky is Japanese, and he's married to an African American woman. And when I moved to San Antonio, I met my wife because her father's job had moved him from Dallas to San Antonio, and I ended up meeting her there. We were at the same church in Dallas, and ended up having to move 300 miles to a different city before we actually found one another. We got married. That happened in 2000, but my father-in-law did not let us get married until 2004. And we didn't want to get married without his consent, and he made sure that I was ready. So he took about 3.5 years to get me ready. And that same year, the year we got married, we moved to Denver, and the goal was to get back to Texas. I wanted to get a PhD in philosophy, and I didn't want to be a pastor. I wanted to teach philosophy I wanted to be the Christian presence on a non-Christian campus. One of my models for that is a man named Jay Budiszewski. Jay Budiszewski is a professor of government and philosophy at the University of Texas, and he's known as the Christian professor, even though he doesn't teach anything Christianity. So but he's a very top shelf. He's a top shelf thinker, a good philosopher, and he does apologetics really well. I wanted to do that on a non-Christian campus. But when we moved here, about maybe 2 years into seminary, someone bought a house in our name near City Park, about 3 blocks behind East High School, across the street from City Park. And I'm from South Dallas, so I want to go see who bought this house in my name. You'll catch that in the car. So my wife and I go to the neighborhood, and we see the house, and it's just a vacant lot. And Wells Fargo approved a loan on a house on that lot. Don't ask me how that happened, because about 5 years later, when my wife and I were buying our house, our first bank of choice was Wells Fargo, and they made us give up a kidney before they would approve us. But someone could steal my identity. I had to actually say, I said, you approved someone else in my name, and now I'm actually here, and I'm having to jump through all these hoops. But while we were there, we're looking at this vacant lot, we noticed a man who was standing on the corner across the street from City Park, and he was shaking the hands of everyone who walked by. And I explained to my wife what was happening, because he was doing a dope exchange right there on the corner. They would shake the hands through the exchange. And my wife, who grew up in a very, very sheltered home in the suburbs, and her father is Reverend Floyd Spencer, I had to walk her through that. And when I told her what was happening, I said out loud, someone should do something about this. And she said, yeah, Brandon, someone should. And she looked at me in that way that made me realize that she's going to hold me accountable to what I just said. So in that moment, we both realized we're not moving back to Texas. And then we planted the Embassy Church, and we had about a year-long runway getting ready for it, but we launched the church in April of 2012. Is that right? Yeah, 2012. We turned 8 years old this year. And we are actually not near. We wanted to meet at East, but the principal at East said no. And I'm glad they said that, because we ended up meeting at Cole, which is where we are now. And Cole's more in the neighborhood, better parking, and also better access for people who are walking. And under normal circumstances, that's where we meet on Sunday morning. We're looking into purchasing a facility right now, but that's only because we do need some facility autonomy, because even after the state frees us up to meet in the school again, the school may say no.
Right.
And so we had last Sunday was our Vision Sunday. We go over our budget on Sunday morning. And one of the things I presented to them was how much money we need to have in our building fund. I can't stand the words building fund, because I grew up in church land where those two words are ugly words to when you put them together. We had a building fund in my church when I was growing up, but we didn't paint the church, let alone buy anything. But So I felt a way saying that, but I told them how much we need in the building fund for a down payment, and God has been so good at providing for us that this is the first year in several years I was able to give them a report where our giving so far exceeded our operating cost, and it's in the middle of a pandemic. Our giving did not go up, it did not go down, it went up. And our cost of operating went down because we weren't paying rent anymore since we weren't using the school. And so we're looking into buying a facility now, but we didn't want to do that. We wanted to stay in the school. There's 752 kids in that school, in that building. There's two schools in the same building. Those 752 kids probably represent 640, 650 households because of siblings who come out of the same household. And we have a very good relationship with them. Last year, one student shot another, and the principal didn't call the school district for counseling. She called us.
Wow.
And she had us meet with every one of her teachers one-on-one. We were there all day and met with them one-on-one to gospel them through the hardship and pain of that. And so when anyone comes to me with separation of church and state, listen, even non-believers want God when a child shoots another child. When buildings fell in New York, everyone was talking about God that day. And it was the church's job to maximize those ears that are listening. And I'm saying that for a reason. I am 40. How old am I? What year is this? I'm 44 years old.
Oh, it's 2020, baby. You're not going to forget that.
Yeah. I'll be 45 in October. This is the first time in my life that this many people were listening to this discussion regarding ethnic rift and justice to this degree. It's the first time in my life that's ever happened. And my concern is that the church maximize the moment and be the gospel voice that gives authority behind where the country should be headed on this issue. So I appreciate you taking the time to get us together so we can have this conversation. That was a long introduction.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. Let's just kind of jump right into the deep end. Can you recount for us just a story about the first time that you encountered racism aimed at you?
Oh, every time I've been asked that question quite a few times. And every time I'm asked that question, I tell a different story. I was always aware of race because I grew up in a house where my parents taught me that. My father's from Natchez, Mississippi. So when we go to Natchez, Mississippi, that's when you see it's grade A racism there. So he's made a point to teach his sons what that was like. And it did not become a thing that I had the need to practically work out until I was in I'm sorry. I know Jenny asked you this, but how public is this going to be? I'm trying to figure out what I need to edit out.
Well, I'm recording it right now, but I wouldn't post it without your permission.
Okay, because of potential posting, I won't say names. But I had a teacher in my life right around the time I was 10, 11 years old, and she had a very flawed view of intercultural history. Very, very flawed view. So, for example, among the things she taught us was Black people did not know their African names because we forgot them. And she had a very peculiar name. And I asked her, and I've always been this guy. I've always been, listen, just confront the situation and then recover from it later. But my question was, how long would it take for you to forget your name? And she didn't even take into consideration how irrational that argument was. She had not thought it through. She just knew it to be true. Black people forgot their names. And she also affirmed slave owners. She did not affirm slavery, in her defense. She did not affirm slavery, but she did affirm the benevolence of the slave owner by saying that they graciously gave Black people names after they forgot them. I want to say this very carefully. That is absolutely, verifiably ridiculous.
Yes.
In that moment, I recognized how she sees Black people. She was not speaking out of any insight, no discovery, no reading she'd done. She was giving us her assessment of Black people, especially relative to white people. That resulted in me. I tell people all the time, because between the ages of 12 and 17, 18 years old, I was a sympathizer of the nation, within the Nation of Islam. And I tell people all the time, I did not go to them, I was pushed to them. And that teacher is among the people who pushed me toward them, because she was undermining my dignity. She was
Mhm.
undermining my worth. And the Nation of Islam, using an equally flawed, equally erroneous
Mhm.
anthropology, was giving me credibility and give me worth and give me dignity.
Mhm.
So I just wrote there's a pastor who's a friend of mine in Philadelphia named Eric Mason, and Dr. Mason is publishing a book called Urban Apologetics, and he had me write the chapter on philosophy and worldviews. And I told that story, and in the middle of telling that story, while writing it down, I realized that I have not recovered from the wounds that she inflicted upon me.
Mhm.
And I had not, and I was also confronting the equally racist language of the Nation of Islam, the extreme to which I ran in response to the teacher who was giving me this flawed view of who I am. I don't know if that was the first time I encountered racism, but that's the moment that I recognize as a formative moment.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. Yeah. Tell us where places that you have seen where the church has ignored or neglected the issue of racial reconciliation, turned a blind eye either willingly or neglectfully.
Mm.
Where do you see that most prominent? How does that show up?
Okay, now that's a complicated question because I talk a lot, so I'm gonna try to get to the center. But here's the thing you have to realize we're dealing with right now. Um, if I wrote an article entitled "Black and Evangelical"
Mhm.
because I'm both.
Mhm.
I wrote that for Christianity Today, and I caught a lot of heat for writing that from my Black friends because they're walking away from evangelicalism.
Mhm.
But my attempt to, and I stood firm on it because I think I have a pretty good assessment of what's going on here. I stood firm on it because I think that what we're dealing with is not evangelicalism. We're dealing with the hijacking of evangelicalism. I think we're dealing with a flawed understanding of the history that got us to where we are now. So let me give you a quick run through what I think happened here. If you Evangelicalism links its birth, its inception, to the Reformation. So we often look to people like Martin Luther, and the emphasis on salvation by grace through faith alone, which I happen to agree with. I just think it's overemphasized. But we link it to the Reformation, and I have two things to say about that. Number one, there was more than one Reformation. Martin Luther was not the only reformer. So you have the Lutheran Reformation that occurred in Germany. You have the Swiss Reformation that occurred under John Calvin. You have the English Reformation, which is how we got the Anglican Church to this day. That was not even a theological disagreement. That was more a political and ethical disagreement. The king kept divorcing and killing wives. So, and the Roman Catholic Church said you can't kill your wife, and he kept doing it. So he said, well, I'm just gonna make my own church, and that's how I'm summarizing it very quickly, but that's how we end up getting the Anglican Church. And then you also have the Anabaptist movement, which is where we have Quakers right now, and and like goodness, I just drew a blank on the word. The community that lives in the buggies with no electricity. They make the
Amish, Mennonite
the
Brethren.
Amish community. Thank you. The Brethren crew, that kind of thing.
Mhm.
And the problem with that is the Lutheran, the Swiss, and the English Reformation were empiricist in nature, and they were very they emphasized their white identity. Not so much among the Anabaptists. In fact, I tell people all the time that if you want to get a sound understanding of practical living, look at the Anabaptists, because they were being persecuted by both the Roman Catholic Church and other reformers
Mhm.
because they were rebaptizing people, and the reformers did not agree with that, and neither did the Roman Catholic Church. So they were actually killing them for doing it. So you don't get a lot of large books on systematic theology from the Anabaptists because they were living their lives on the run, trying to keep from being killed. And I'm a fan of some of the theology that came out of doing theology from the margins, which is what they had to do. But if you contrast them with Luther, Luther was a brazen anti-Semite.
Mhm.
Wrote a book about it, wrote a book defending it. Okay. Then you fast forward about 150 to 200 years and you get to the Americas, you get to the 17th, 18th centuries. and we experienced the Great Awakenings. And who are the heroes of the Great Awakenings? Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield. I mean, we also have John Wesley. But I put John Wesley in a different category because they were not fans of Wesley. And among the reasons they weren't fans of him was his theology and because he was also an abolitionist. Okay. But both Edwards and Whitefield owned slaves. In fact, Jonathan Edwards preached more than one sermon defending the ownership of slaves. And George Whitefield campaigned in the state of Georgia against abolitionism. So he was not just a slave proponent, he was anti-abolition. In fact, his argument was he's the head of a orphanage there, and he said, I cannot afford to run this orphanage for white children if you take away my free labor. And that argument won the day for a while. Okay. And these are stalwarts of the Great Awakenings. You have Martin Luther in the 16th, 17th, and early 17th century. And you have the Great Awakenings in America in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. And those are key points along the way that we call evangelicalism. And we are fooling ourselves if we do not believe that the voices of that movement, the racism that they espouse, did not infiltrate their theology. It's misleading to teach people that. So that gets passed down generationally, what I was considering. Their hermeneutic, their approach to theological method, the way they interpret certain passages, that gets passed on to us generationally. Now, I would argue, I'm almost done. I would argue there's a third point in history that we should take into consideration that would revise our understanding of evangelicalism, and that's the 20th century civil rights movement. But we don't include that one in the defining of what evangelicalism is. And in the absence of that one, or without the emphasis on the Anabaptists from the 16th century, we have this emphasis on orthodoxy, right belief, but we do not give appropriate attention to orthopraxy, right behavior, right practice. And because of that, the idea of confronting matters of injustice is treated as either inappropriate or at the very best, it's secondary. You would be surprised by how many people sent me messages to critique my willingness to make a link between the gospel and justice. They consider that irresponsible. There's a pastor of a very large church in California, whom you would all know, who drafted a statement on the issue and had very well-known people sign it. I will say this name: Al Mohler refused to sign it. Okay, he did very carefully decide to not do that. And their argument is, instead of preaching justice, preach the gospel. And my response to them is, the gospel is invariably linked. The justice is invariably linked to the gospel. And wherever the gospel is, justice should be also. And there's a peculiar pushback because we're separating out the civil rights movement as a non-Christian movement, which it wasn't. It was entirely a Christian movement. And because we're separating that out, the idea of earthly justice being an essential responsibility of the church has not been brought to the forefront for us. And in the absence of us recognizing that, my answer to your question is, it is not uncommon for churches to either be indifferent, unaware, or oppose the idea of preaching justice in this manner. I can't give you one because I so consistently get pushback from people who are opposed to the manner in which I emphasize this. I think that we don't like treating justice as a fruit of the gospel. I have a pear tree in my front yard, and I did not know it was a pear tree. I found it was a pear tree because my HOA hired tree trimmers to go through the neighborhood and trim the trees. I have a thing about that. I'm just not getting over it. But don't send people to my house to cut my trees. I bought that tree when I bought the house, but I'm over it now. I guess I'm not, but you get my point.
Yeah.
I come home and I'm mending my yard with power tools. That's a problem for me. They trim the oak tree out near the sidewalk, and then they look at the tree that's in the middle of my yard, and then he tells me, we're not going to trim this one. And I asked him why not. Now, listen, I was already ahead of him. You're not trimming my tree. But I asked him why he had decided that without me saying anything. He said, the HOA told us to not trim the fruit trees, to not do anything to the fruit trees. I said, this is a fruit tree because it has never borne any fruit. And he said, yeah, this is a pear tree. I said, I'm glad it's not bearing any fruit because I'm very particular about my yard. I don't have to go through and collect the pears from the yard before I cut the grass.
Yeah.
But just out of curiosity, why isn't it bearing any fruit? What's wrong with the tree? Why have I never seen any pears on this tree? And he said, it's a domesticated pear tree.
Mm.
He said, botanists have figured out how to breed the ability to bear fruit out of the tree. And I said, why would you do that? He says, didn't you just say you don't want pears in the yard? I said, I did. He said, do you want the tree? I said, I do. It's large, it casts shade, it has blooms on it, which is why I should have known it was a fruit tree. And it's aesthetically pleasing. He says, that's right. You want all the benefits of the tree, but you don't have to deal with the inconvenience of its fruit. So we domesticated the ability for it to bear fruit out of the tree. And you gotta realize I'm a preacher. So before he was done, I ran to the car to get my moleskin so I could write this down.
Yes.
Because it came to mind for me right away is we have domesticated the gospel. Because justice is an inevitable fruit of the gospel, but it can be inconvenient. So we want the gospel. We want its shade, we want its covering, we want its justification, but we don't want the inconvenience that comes with having to pursue justice as we're preaching that gospel. So we've domesticated the message so it does not have to bear that fruit. That's more common than I would like to think. This is the first time I've ever heard so many churches reconsider their view of justice and its correlation to the gospel.
Which
that's
seems
my answer.
Which seems really bizarre to me because you're taking the justice out of the justification.
I hear you.
Which,
I'm sorry, I wish I could help you.
Yeah, which seems strange to me. And so, building off that point, I have seen signs around that say the system isn't broken; it was designed this way. The system is working; it's accomplishing exactly what it's supposed to in protests and things like that. So clearly what we're doing here is we're not trying to change an individual or a group of people's minds or hearts or perspectives. It runs much deeper than that in this systemic infiltration that we're facing now. And so, I mean, we're a local church in Denver, 125 people, 150 people. How do we go about attacking, rewriting, rebuilding, deconstructing if needed, and rebuilding a system that's so pervasive? You have any thoughts on something like that?
I do. A couple of things. We have to be careful with our message. I'm a big fan of carefully laying out the terms that define your message. Right. Most movements have poor branding, so you end up having to come back and fixing. So right now, the consistent poor branding language I've heard of late is people saying defund the police when they don't actually mean defund the police. That's not what they actually mean. So you end up having to define terms and correct misunderstandings of that. You have to be careful with that because you don't want, I'm not saying defund the police at all, but I will say that we do give the police department responsibilities that police officers should not have. I'm not calling a police officer to my house to get a cat out of a tree. And I don't think you should call a police officer to deal with a person who is plagued with extreme autism or bipolar disorder. A healthcare professional is much more suited to that. So rerouting some resources to those areas of our government's infrastructure is just a good idea. I think that sometimes a shooting will occur because physical violence is the default means which a police officer is trained to address complex scenarios. But if a healthcare professional is on the scene, they may have known some things they could address, or they could anticipate or see some symptoms that are not known to a police officer. So we have to address some of the language that we're using. But the bigger thing is we have to be careful with how we define the word racism as it relates to police. Now, are there racist police officers? Yes. There are racist pastors. There are racist everything. Okay, I just told you about a teacher from when I was in the 5th grade. There's racist everything. But I don't think we're dealing with the individual racists. And that's the branding issue when it comes to how we have this conversation. Because we're going to end up, what's going to happen in Minneapolis is we're going to punish at least one, maybe three, frankly, maybe not even that one, I have to see that before I believe it. Of the police officers who were on the scene when George Floyd died. And then everyone's going to turn to us and say, see, justice was served. But I'm telling you that that's not the solving of the problem, because all you've done is addressed individual expressions of a systemic or institutional issue.
Mm-hmm.
So, I have to be careful in emphasizing this. So when I address systemic racism of our judicial and our policing system, I will consistently get, so you're saying that all police officers are racist? No, I'm saying that if the infrastructure is innately biased, then it doesn't matter who the police officer is, because they're implementing an infrastructure that is innately biased. Sometimes unwittingly, they're carrying out a biased approach to governing people because they were trained that this is what policing is. You have to be careful here. It's the reason you can have Freddie Gray get into a paddy wagon in Baltimore and his neck works fine. But by the time he gets to the police department, his neck is broken. And I got emails telling me that the majority of the police officers who transferred him from the scene of him being arrested to the police department were Black, which is evidence that police officers cannot be racist. Well, first of all, Black people can be racist toward Black people. Let's kill that myth right now. But the bigger thing is, it doesn't matter who the arbiter of the structure is if the infrastructure is racist. So in the same way that I just gave you a snapshot of evangelicalism's history, you find out where it started and the process by which you got to where you are now. You have to do that with a policing system, because that may explain some of the flaws, the biases, the fallenness of the infrastructure. And if you address that, then you will address much of the problem. And policing in America was originally intended to patrol former slaves. That policing did not exist prior to that moment. Did an individual town have a sheriff or a marshal? Yes. But the manner, the structure of a policing system as we have it now was not implemented until 1866. And it was directly responding to the liberation of slaves. And here was the logic behind it. They wanted to figure out, the South especially, wanted to figure out, how do you get slavery now that slavery has been outlawed? And so you have you enter into that Reconstruction and then Jim Crow era. No, it's all around the Jim Crow and then Reconstruction eras. So what do? You make it illegal for someone to be unemployed. That actually happened. It was against the law to be unemployed. You know who's going to be unemployed in droves? Former slaves, especially since, as a cultural decision, the dominant culture decided to not hire former slaves. Now, here's the logic behind that. If they're unemployed, they can be arrested. And the 13th Amendment very carefully allowed for one exception to prohibition of slavery, to the abolition of slavery. And that is, those who are prisoners can still be treated as slaves. They can still get unpaid labor from those who have been imprisoned. We do that to this day. It's one of the reasons I have a problem with the privatization of the prison system, because we're letting private companies take advantage of that exception in the 13th Amendment regarding slavery. That is the case in 2020. So if slaves can be treated as prisoners, and it's illegal for you to be unemployed, and we are not going to employ you, they can systematically go about arresting former slaves and therefore re-enslaving them because they're now prisoners again. That's how our policing system started. And if that's how it began, it had an innate bias in it from day one. And you have to address that bias. It only perpetuated going forward. So in the early 20th century, it is not an accident that in large cities like Chicago and New York, a specific ethnic group became the policing ethnic group. It became an Irish act. Okay, a particular cultural identity took on the role of that, and Black people were not allowed to be a part of that. And they were not allowed to be a part of the governing structure that would have repaired much of its brokenness. That's not an accident. That's not an accident. You have to step back and say, how did this start, and how did its beginning perpetuate along the way? And because we never stopped to assess its origin and its history, has its origin carried all the way into 2020? And I would contend that the answer to that question is yes. So I'm not confronting the individual racist in the policing system. We would not get anywhere we did that. I think you have to confront the structure, the institution, confront the systemic brokenness of it, and then that's how you address the individuals who are taking advantage of the broken system.
Can you point to, and I misworded this question when I sent it to Jenny, who passed it on to you. Can you point to churches that are doing that it's not just saying, hey folks, go out and vote, whoever, if we have the opportunity to pick a sheriff, there's legislation out there, go out and do it. I mean, can you point to churches that are taking a role in the changing of that institutional heritage that has been passed down generation after generation after generation?
I can't give you a church I mean, I'm sure that they exist, but I can't give you a church that's confronting it on a policing level. But churches that are emphasizing the value of diversity and integration as a biblical imperative, I can give you a list of those off the top of my head. There's a church in Atlanta that's pastored by actually a friend of mine named Leonce Crump, called Renovation Church, and they're doing an excellent job of it. Leonce is not a wallflower. It doesn't hurt that he's 6'6" and 220 pounds and played in the NFL. But they value that. I do want to say this, though, and I want to say it's I have to do this in as selfless a manner as possible. It is a non-negotiable, uncompromising value of the Embassy Church where I pastor. Sure. We've lost people over this. We've lost Black people over it. Yeah, black people will come. There have been white people when we first started who told us we can't join this church because there are too many white people here. I'm sorry, too many Black people here. We can't join your church because there's too many Black people here. And then once we got past that, and Black people, and when white people started coming, Black couples who had been with us the whole time came and said, we can't be here because now there's too many white people here. And on every occasion, we just said, listen, we didn't trick you. We didn't trick you. Our very first listed distinctive is diversity and integration. Mm-hmm. We did not trick you. Right. We believe that this is how the church is supposed to look.
Right.
So when we say to them that we value diversity and integration, we think that we're carrying out an Ephesians chapter 2, verses 1 through 22 scenario. Verses 1 through 10 of Ephesians 2 tells you that Christ died to reconcile humanity to God. And verses 11 through 22 tells us that Christ died, the very same death, the same gospel, the same life, death, burial, and resurrection. He died so that he could reconcile us to one another. The gospel did not accomplish one of those things. It accomplished both. We have both vertical and horizontal reconciliation because of what happened on the cross. And if you want me to give up part of that, then you ask me to domesticate the gospel and make it fruitless, to kill some of its fruit, and we're not doing that. So we've lost people over this. We've lost if we were in Texas and chose to be a Black church, the church would be 5,000 people by now. But we value this as a priority. We don't just emphasize diversity. We say diversity and integration, because it's possible for people to come to church on Sunday morning and the room looks diverse. And they can check their box. Oh, I hung out with people who don't look like me for an hour and a half. And then when they're done, they go to separate ways after the benediction, and their lives never interact with one another. That's not an integrated life. We don't want you to just be diverse on Sunday for a good photo op. We want your lives to rub against one another so that the differences among you can benefit all of you. The differences among you can benefit all of you. It's a value of ours.
And is that, how does that trickle down to the practical? Give us, because that's great. You can have a mission statement, you can paint it on all the walls in the building, and still it never makes it down past those leaders who painted it on the wall. So how does the Embassy Church then make that very practical, bringing the cookies down a few shelves?
Excellent point. That's excellent. So a couple of things. The typical thing that comes to mind for people when it comes to church is Sunday morning. So it affects the manner in which you approach Sunday morning. So our worship is deliberately diverse, deliberately so. We made it very clear to people that you're going to have to put some of your cultural identity on the altar when you come here, so that people who do not share that culture will be welcome here.
And is that in the faces that you have up front? Is that in the expression that the congregation then feels comfortable in, hey, you know what? Yeah, we're gonna do some dance. We're gonna move around. We're gonna be verbally expressive, and that's okay. I mean, is it that kind of thing when you talk about that?
Absolutely. Yeah, we have very Presbyterian, Anglican-esque people in the room, and we have far more emotive people in the same room. But it's not just that; it's also the style of music that we sing.
Okay.
So we have, you know, on one Sunday we'll have we'll sing a song that's a contemporary Christian song, which is typically identified with a white cultural norm. And then on that same Sunday, we'll sing a gospel song. We will never have a gospel Sunday and then on a different week, a contemporary Christian Sunday, because that's still segregating under one roof.
Sure.
So we do them all on the same day. And what happens if you do that for a while, people start to notice the distinctions between them, but they stop thinking this song's for them and the next one will be for me. They stop thinking in those terms. They start thinking all of these songs are for God, and we are to be the choir, not the audience, who are singing these songs back to God, who are rehearsing these songs back to God. We have to do it across cultural lines. It does affect the manner in which we have, in which we staff. I am unashamed of it. You have to be qualified to have to be a part of our team, but we deliberately avoid having a ethnically homogeneous team. We're currently looking for an executive pastor, and I am unapologetic in saying our executive pastor cannot be black. Cannot be black, because we want leadership to look like the room. People tend to come to a place where the leaders look like them. So that's the first thing. The second thing is we have what we call missional communities. That's our home groups, and so those are the groups that meet in our homes. We've leaned heavily into them during this time of not being able to gather on Sunday morning. We call them missional community tables. And we call them tables because we try to keep them to a group of around 8 to 10 people, which is roughly how many people can sit around a large table. And our pastor over that is named Derek Kelsey, and his policy is we will never have a missional community or small group, home group, that is an affinity group. So we will never have a home group that's all singles. We don't have a married home group. We do not have one that's all women. We don't have one that's all men. We have what we call medium groups, so where the guys can break out and go do a guy thing, and the ladies have their women's ministry kind of thing. But in those missional communities, that is where life on life ministry happens, and he will not allow them to be an affinity group. So he assigns you to that group based on either relationship, an existing relationship, or geography, wherever you live. You get one that's close to you. And the thing I've noticed is when you have an organically diverse group of people who are actually engaging one another. This is different from Sunday morning, because during the sermon, I'm preaching and no one's, well, they're talking back because it's black people in the room, but
Right.
but they're not, it's not a dialogue. Okay. The sermon's monological, but in the missional community, they're actually having a dialogue. Mm-hmm. And what happens when you have one missional community in a diverse church, and in that one missional community, you have a person who has Make America Great Again sign in their yard. And in that same missional community, you have a person who has I'm With Her sign in their yard. Those disagreements end up coming up during those conversations. And each of them ends up learning from one another, and they get different perspective because they're around someone who has experience and a perspective that's different from their own. We benefit from insisting that those missional communities not just be a diverse group, but an integrated one, and we do that from that base level. So leadership is diverse. We do not have. We even do this on like what our worship teams look like, and how we handle lay leaders. We deliberately try to have the lay leaders be a diverse team, and then we put them in our missional communities where they're doing life with one another, and it's organically diverse. Not just, I want to be very careful here, because we don't just value ethnic diversity, but we also value generational diversity. We also value relationship diversity. So we have both marrieds and singles. Mm-hmm. We value gender diversity, and it's not because we want diversity for the sake of being diverse, but I know this, my missional community has lots of single people in it. And I've been married for so long that I'd forgotten what single people deal with.
Hmm.
So I've benefited from having singles in my missional community. There was a single woman who said to me, Pastor, you said something last Sunday during the sermon that hurt my feelings. I'm like, okay, what is it now? And then she said, you discussed singleness, but you discussed it in a very simplified manner. And she said, you don't know what it's like to be 34 years old and you've never been married and you have no prospects. And we had a conversation about that slightly changed my view on the matter,
Hmm.
because her diversity, her view was brought into our diversity and benefited everyone else.
Hmm. Yeah, that's beautiful. That's great. That's great. Let me switch gears a little bit
Mm-hmm.
and ask you this question, and I will use myself as the test subject. So feel free to take me to task on this. There are
Okay.
times, there have been times, a lot of times, almost all of the time, where on social media platforms and things, there's an issue that's come up, racism, etc., where I have been silent, and it's not because I'm afraid of voicing my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
And having to deal with somebody coming back at me, a racist telling me, or someone saying that I'm wrong, or um, somebody challenging my view of the inherent worth and value of all people created in the image of God. I don't have any problem with that. I can deal with those people all day long. What my rationale is in being silent is that I'm afraid that I'm going to say something and I'm going to get shots fired from those that I'm trying to support. And if I'm going to get shots from both sides, it's better for me just to stay quiet. So in a situation like that, how would you, I don't know what the right word is, encourage me? How would you challenge me? How would you invite me to throw my support, however that looks, whether that is through social media channels, whether that's actually online, um, or in person, in a protest? How would you encourage or challenge somebody like me who's like, man, I'm worried about getting shots from both sides. That's not worth it. I will just continue my silent approach of, yeah, when I see people, I recognize who they are, see the image of God in them. I value, I respect them, I love them. I don't treat them any different. I work to confront some of my own biases. But that kind of larger, louder platform, I'm just going to leave that alone.
Right. So a couple of things. Number one, some things are taught and some things are caught.
Mm-hmm.
And so some things you can be someone, you sit under someone's tutelage and they will teach you how to handle an issue. But other things, you just have to learn how it works by watching it done. So I would tell you while you're in that season, because sometimes being quiet is better than saying the wrong thing. I'll be the first one to say that out loud. But while you're in that season of being quiet, sit at the feet of someone, either immediately or indirectly, and get a glimpse into how they're handling it. Once you find those trusted people, even before you start speaking, a thing I suggest is, if it's a credible, respectable person who's handling this in a godly manner and can carefully articulate what the concerns are and the Bible's view on it. Even if I have a friend named Larry Phillips Thomas, and he says sometimes he said, I always want to be a voice on behalf of justice, but sometimes it's better for me to be an echo. So the word may not be his, but he will post a quote from someone who has said it for him, who has said something that's credible. And I often recommend that to my friends who have the struggle you have. If you quote Leonce Crump or Thabiti Anyabwile on this issue, it's academically done, it's mindful of Black culture, it's uncompromising, it's biblical, it's gospel saturated. And after you've done it a few times, you will start to ingest the idea for yourself, and you won't have to quote them anymore. The one thing I will not say is it's okay to say nothing. It's okay to do nothing. If anytime someone's in jeopardy, silence is sin. I get that from Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I have never been more convinced of anything than that when people are being unjustly wounded, and battered, silence is sin. So it's not appropriate to say nothing. And I will often challenge my friends who are they'll say to me, I don't know if it's my place to jump into this situation, and I will bring to their attention whenever another ethical issue presents itself, you're not quiet. In fact, the refrain on this is not a race issue. This is a sin issue. Listen to me. Shut up with that. Okay, racism is sin, and we did not decide to use race. This is not a race issue, it's sin. We don't do that in other areas. So my friends who will get up and they will preach biblically solid, defensible sermons that are pro-life. And so on that day, you did not restrict it to sin, you confronted the specific sin. When they get up and they preach sermons regarding what marriage is, on that day you didn't have a conversation about sin, you address what is biblically true about marriage. In this scenario, there's a biblical truth regarding our ethnic identity and innate worth as image bearers of God. And so confront that. And if you have to figure out how to do that, then sometimes it's better to be an echo until you're able to be a voice. Chip, you're neither echoed nor a voice because you muted yourself.
Thank you. I appreciate the challenge that you've laid out there for me personally. Another question. I have, like I said before, I have absolutely no problem recognizing the inherent value of African American community and recognizing how they have been treated over the course of history. Give me your perspective on the Black Lives Matter movement. Theologically, I can say that all day long. I have no problem with that. My hesitation is that is becoming more of a political statement, and I'm not 100% sure that I want to jump behind that. I've had people tell me, nope, that is not they're antithetical to Christian values. But I would just like to hear from you on that issue, knowing that maybe that might be a question that other people in our church community have as well.
Right. I have not felt, listen, I am very Black, been Black for a really long time.
Almost 45 years?
Almost 45 years. And I'm proud of it, unapologetically so. Okay. I have not aligned myself with the formal organization known as Black Lives Matter. Mm-hmm. And I do not anticipate doing so anytime soon for a couple reasons. Number one, as a church, it is a policy that we do not take political positions. So you will never see a political candidate standing on the platform at our church. I don't care what party it is. I could agree with them. They're not going to stand here because we don't do that for a couple reasons. Number one, if I mess around and affirm a guy, then in the next term, it'll be someone who I cannot affirm, and then I'll be held accountable for having affirmed someone. So that's first. And second thing is, oftentimes people will make a promise in front of a crowd that they don't carry out, and then I put my name on it, and I don't want to do that. So we will never, as a policy, the elders would not allow, if I wanted to, and I don't, the elders would not allow me to do that. But the bigger thing is, I think Black Lives Matter has taken on an informal, capital BLM, I want to be very careful here, has taken on a political identity. And my bigger concern sometimes is not philosophy, but practice. So I may agree with them, but the manner in which they're executing the common idea is not something I can associate with. I have had to tell people emphatically that I do not endorse rioting and looting. Do not endorse it. Looting is not protesting. In fact, looting may undermine the veracity of your message. I do know this. It custom makes a red herring for your opponent because they're going to generalize everyone into the category of the looter. And then when you bring your legitimate concerns to the attention of the powers that be, you're going to get ignored because you've been categorized as looters. I have to very carefully remind people that there are genuine, heartfelt protesters who are out in the streets trying to be advocates for justice. And there are other people who are out in the streets because in the middle of all the chaos and crowds, they can steal a flat screen and get some dark liquor and go home and live their lives independent of what's going on in the world. I'm not a fan of looting. I do have to be careful with rioting sometimes, though, because rioting sometimes is legitimately the voice of the unheard.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to be careful that we don't be so dismissive. I will say this: Colin Kaepernick took a silent knee and took criticism. You can't tell people that a silent protest is inappropriate for forever without them basically saying, "Okay, if that's not good enough for you, I'm going to get loud on you. If you're going to take issue with silence, I'm going to get loud."
Mm-hmm.
Martin Luther King said that rioting is the voice, it's the language of the unheard. And I think some people are not rioting because of the opportunity to steal. It's a genuine heartfelt brokenness, a discontent. And you cannot assess a reaction as though it is an action.
Mm.
You have to go to the action that prompted the reaction. And if you make someone endure oppression, marginalization, or injustice for their entire lives, do not stand back in awe if they riot. Having said that, I'm saying to you, looting and protesting are not the same thing. And sometimes my friends locally will take a semi-riot posture that I cannot associate with. Having said that, the concept of Black Lives Matter, the slogan, the statement, the idea,
Mm-hmm.
is something I wholly affirm. And I get criticism for saying that because people say that means that you're saying that Black Lives Matter. People are treating that as though Black Lives Matter exclusively, and they'll come to me with all lives matter. Let me tell you two things I have an issue with that. Two reasons I have a problem with that. Number one, that's taking the statement out of its context. You've all seen the meme by now where Jesus is going through the Beatitudes and he says, "Blessed are the poor," and then there's this person from the crowd that says, "No, Jesus, blessed are all people." Jesus takes issue with that because you're dishonoring the context in which he's speaking. He's talking about a specific scenario, and Black Lives Matter is not saying that it is not that other lives don't matter.
Mm-hmm.
It's saying that in this scenario we have to prioritize this particular people group. I'll give you a prime example of that. I have a friend who attends the church who attends my church, who took issue with the slogan Black Lives Matter. We discussed it, didn't change his mind. We moved on. About 2 weeks later, the Broncos were getting ready to draft. This was right before they won the Super Bowl. This was that same season. He says the Broncos were getting ready to draft and shore up their team a bit, and he says they need to get some strong defensive players. And those of you who watched the Broncos in the Super Bowl know that it wasn't Peyton Manning who won the Super Bowl. It was the defense, specifically. Let's draw a blank on his name. Who was the MVP?
Von Miller.
Von Miller, specifically Von Miller. Sacks all over the place. Okay, the defense won that game. Okay, and I have a friend who predicted that was going to happen. And I said, "You told me that the defense was going to win that game." And he says, "That's right. Defense is important." I said, "Wait a minute, Bruce. Why are you hating on Peyton Manning like that?" And he said, "What are you talking about?" I said, "You just said that defense is important. That must mean that offense is not."
Mm-hmm.
And he said, "No, we're talking about defense right now." I said, "Right. When people say Black Lives Matter, we're talking about Black people right now. It's not a commentary on anything else.
Mm-hmm.
Don't snatch the slogan out of its context. It's a disservice to the point." So the political movement may be troubling, but the concept needs energy. It needs our attention.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you again. We're coming up on a time here. It's just about 8:00. I want to give you a chance to freestyle. What is the question that we're not asking? What is burning in your heart that you want to say, that you've got a captive audience right now, that we're listening to you? What do you want to say to us? I mean, this is your wild card. Just play anything you want.
Okay. Oh man. Okay. Couple things. Okay. So I'll give you. I will answer a question I get a lot. So they know I value diversity and integration. Okay, many people know that. And my friends will ask me, what about those of us who live in Hockey Puck, Nebraska, where there are no Black people? How can we be diverse there? Or even the state of Colorado. The state of Colorado is only 4.4% Black. That's not a lot of Black people. Denver brings the average up, by the way, because Denver is just somewhere between 11 and 13. So the state is at 4 because of Denver.
Hmm.
And people will say to me, how do you have diversity in that situation? And I have to clarify something. There's a difference between ethnic diversity and cultural diversity.
Hmm.
And you can be culturally diverse even if you're not ethnically diverse.
Mhm.
In fact, I would contend that you should strive toward cultural diversity. And if you do that, ethnic diversity will come. But the reverse is not true. Because it's possible for you to strive toward ethnic diversity, but everyone still has the same cultural identity. And so people who don't identify with the subdominant cultures won't be there. So here's the language we have to use here. We misuse the word race. I contend that the word racism is racist. So I'm going to ask everyone a question now. Okay, I don't know if you've heard me do this before. If you have, just you can't participate here. But how many races are there? This is not a trick question. I'm known for trick questions. This is not one of them. Okay.
I would say there's
How
one.
many? There is only one. There's only one. Everyone's okay. You should pay your pastor more because he knew the answer. Okay. There's only one, the human race. There's only one. And that's not, I hear people say that and it's corny and it's poorly thought out and it's often deflecting. No, biblically speaking, there's only one race. The mistake we're making is we treat the word race and ethnicity as synonyms, and they are not.
Mm-hmm.
They're not the same. They don't have the same definition.
Absolutely.
Our understanding of race is informed by people like Adolf Hitler, and we have a very Hitlerian view of what race is. Whiteness is a social, to use the language of Dr. Williams at Southern Seminary, Jarvis Williams. He says that whiteness is a social, is a biological fiction, but a social fact. It's a creation of humanity. It was a way of a people group who are not the same ethnic group to identify themselves in one homogenous group to distinguish themselves from Black people. Because if you're Black, then you could be a slave. But if you were Italian, people didn't know what to call you, didn't know what to do with you. If you were French, in the Americas, people didn't know what to do with you. Irish, they didn't know what to do with you. So you know what they all did? They came up with the concept of whiteness and then homogenized themselves into one group to distinguish themselves from Blackness. And one of the privileges of being in a homogenized group is you could not be a slave. It's an invention. There's only one race. Now, that one race is comprised of several ethnicities, and those ethnicities are comprised of even more cultures. So I am African American, and by and large, not by and large, but significantly, my DNA is informed by a continental African identity. Okay, and I have friends who are continental Africans. I have one with whom I went to seminary named Emmanuel, and we were on campus, and people assumed that we were very similar. This is also true of Dr. Gilbert, Dr. Felix Gilbert. That people assume we're the same because we are ethnically very similar. But Dr. Gilbert is Caribbean, and I am African American, specifically Texan, which is a planet all by itself. Okay, and because he's Caribbean in culture, and I am Texan in culture, we have several differences in spite of the fact that we are the same, generally speaking, the same ethnicity. So you have one race. That one race is comprised of several ethnicities, and those many ethnicities are they identify with even more cultures.
Mm-hmm.
The church should pursue cultural diversity. And you can do that even if representatives of that culture are not present.
Hmm.
And if you do that, people who are of the ethnic group who identify with those cultures will feel welcome in your church. So even if you are in some remote suburban community outside of Lincoln, Nebraska, recognizing the values and culture and history of Black people can happen in the absence of Black people being there. And people will tell me, well, wait a minute, it's hard for us to know what it's like to be Black. I didn't say that, okay? But you can know what Black identity and culture are because, and if you need evidence of that, Black people have to do it all the time. I'm a proud graduate of Denver Seminary. And I got to tell you something, I had to assimilate the cultural norms of that school so that I could thrive. And I also had to figure out how to translate it for my cultural context, translate the education I received for my cultural context so that I could pastor in my community well. Black people do it all the time. If we can do it, you can do it.
So can we.
You can do it. Become a student of cultures other than your own.
Mm-hmm.
And that way people see you valuing who they are and they will be drawn to you. You can seek that type of diversity without having to be that person. Now, here's another thing you have going for you though, and I'll stop because I could do this
All day.
Pastor Chip, I could do this all. This is a pet peeve. This is a soapbox for me. There is something to be said about wanting to be around people who are not like you so that you can learn how to value their culture. And you got to do that deliberately. Don't stop insisting on people who are not like you coming to you. Sacrificially go to them. And that will show them how much you value them, and they will benefit from you doing that, and you will benefit from having them. So here's how I try to illustrate it for people. Once you have those experiences with them, you will see the world slightly differently because you will start to adopt their lenses, the perspective through which they see the world. I tell people all the time, this was my second thesis at Denver Seminary. It was hard to get it passed, okay, but I'm persistent. Experience informs epistemology. Epistemology is simply the study of knowledge. Experience informs how you know things. And how you know things informs your theory of ethics, what you believe is right versus wrong. So here's how I illustrate that. My wife drives a Chrysler Town and Country. She has a minivan. And before we married, she made me promise her that I would not buy a minivan. She made me promise. I mean, like a pinky swear and everything. She said, I'm just not a minivan person. I don't want that. And so she made me tell her I was going to buy. My wife is very, very fly. And she's from Houston. So she wants like a Suburban that's presidential black, dark tint and 24-inch rims. And I'm a pastor, so that's not going to happen. And I tricked her. And I'm okay with saying it out loud. Because she hated this minivan, despised it. And then we as a family drove to Dallas for Christmas in 2016. No, that's not true. 2014, we drove to Dallas for Christmas. And I rented a Chrysler Town and Country for that trip. And I drove overnight. And then when the sun came up while we were in Oklahoma somewhere, I said, I need you to take over. And I put her in the driver's seat and had her drive us all the way into Dallas. And about halfway from between Oklahoma City and Dallas, she said, I could have one of these. I could get one of these. This is okay. You know what she's paying attention to? We had kids. And kids come with stuff, car seats and diaper bags, and the minivan has stow and go seating. You don't have to take the seat out of the car, it folds into the floor, and the DVD player in the back, and the kids are watching stuff. It even has, listen to me, it has Bluetooth headphones. So we don't even have to listen to the mess that these kids are watching. We're not having to listen to Doc McStuffins while they're back there watching this. We're having an adult conversation, like two grown people, and they're in the back, oblivious. We're on the road. It's the sweetest thing ever. My wife fell in love with that car. We get there and we drive it around town the whole time. We drive it all the way back to Denver, and before we get back, she says, "Let's go ahead and buy one of these." I hustled her. I don't mind saying it. It's godly. I'm a good husband. Okay. The following day, we go to the dealership. I already knew which one we were going to buy. That's how much I knew it was going to work. And we get there, and the car salesman almost got me in trouble. He says, "Oh, you said you said you're gonna come pick this up today." I said, "Hey man, shut up." Okay, so we end up getting it. She drives the one that I picked out around, and then she loves it. We go make the deal, buy the car. We're getting ready to go home. There's snow on the ground. We're coming out of the dealership. And as we're coming out of the dealership, a Chrysler Town and Country drove right by us. It's 8 o'clock at night and it's snowing, so there were very few cars. But before we got home, we saw 4 more, either Dodge Caravans, which is the same vehicle, or a Chrysler Town and Country. We saw 4 more. We saw 5 of them before we got home. And I jokingly said to my wife, word got out that we bought this car. and we're trendsetters. So everyone else went and bought the same car. You all know that's not what happened. You know what happened? Those cars were always there.
Mm-hmm.
But I did not notice them. I did not notice the Chrysler Town and Countries that were on the road until I had a Chrysler Town and Country experience. The experience gave me lenses that allowed me to gain new information, new knowledge, and that knowledge affected my understanding of Chrysler Town and Countries. Okay? What I tell my dominant culture friends, my white friends, is experience affects your knowledge, and your knowledge will affect your understanding of justice or ethics. Here's the problem. You cannot have every experience, but you can have me. And my experiences become your experiences. And therefore you adopt my lenses. The lenses don't create reality. They give you the ability to see the reality that was always there. You get my lenses and you start to see the world from my perspective. And our theory of justice will get closer together because we have similar lenses. So go to people who have lenses that are different from yours so you can adopt their lenses and see the world the way they see it. That's called loving your neighbor as yourself. It's a selfless, sacrificial act. It is I call it the empathy imperative. It's loving your neighbor as yourself. How you don't just tell them they're wrong for how they see the world. Go to them and find out why they see the world in that manner. And it may result in you seeing it the way they see it.
Yeah. That's great. Thank you.
Yeah. I did one favor, Pastor Chip, before you hang up on me.
Yeah. You said you had one more favor?
I did. I don't know if it's appropriate because there are more of you than I thought. I just know how many people were here. But can you all agree on one? Because we can't take 20 questions, okay? But can you agree on one person to throw a question out on behalf of the crew that we can answer? And I ask that because I'm noticing facial expressions, and the teacher in me doesn't like hanging up on facial expressions.
That's all right.
That's the struggle I'm having.
Yeah. Yeah. Let me do this. I'm just gonna, let's take a look at this. I'm gonna pick Indira. No, are you shaking your head no? I want to.
Too many. It wouldn't just be one. It would go on for all night. So
No. That's the beauty.
No. Yeah, you just qualified yourself. Indira, I need you to do me a favor and throw one question at me.
Being a Latina woman, just thinking about all the times that I've experienced racism in church. How do you, right now, I feel is the time to have those conversations and say, you know what, that comment, that thing you said, or that thing you've done was not okay. And you need to know that this is sinful. And this is what we're talking about, racial reconciliation. This is that issue that we need to address, you know, those attitudes, those phrases, those things that come natural. How do you confront people about that? Or how do we get honest to really get down to the nitty gritty of things?
Very good question. So a couple things. You always want to be mindful of the balance between grace and truth. It's possible for you to be gracious and simultaneously uncompromising. And I noticed that what happens when we have to have those hard conversations, what happens is it becomes an attacking rebuke instead of a loving correction or moving someone in the right direction. Okay. And I think that what we have to be careful here with is finding that spot in the middle where you're uncompromising. It's not okay for someone to say dismissive or hurtful things toward you. How do you confront that without going to level 10? I'm willing to go to level 10 if it gets pressed too long, but you can't start at 10. You have to start. And so one thing I always tell people is when you confront someone, it's always a good idea for you to fixate on what questions you're going to ask them. Approach it Socratically. So instead of telling someone where they should be, do what you can to walk them to walk them to a place by asking the questions that will help them assess the slippery slope of the ideas that they already hold. I just had this conversation with my wife yesterday. She was having to address a thing that a friend of ours did, and so she drafted an email to send to them. And I asked my wife, but what question do you want her to answer? You're answering the questions for her in your confrontation. You're telling her, this is what you did, and this is what it meant. And then I said, no, sometimes a person does not realize the implications of their actions, and they will not understand the implications of their actions until they have to answer the questions regarding those actions. So always start there. And then at a certain point, you have to say, one person plants, the next person waters, and it's God who reaps the increase. So don't think that you serve as the Holy Spirit in the life of everyone. So you walking away with a mind unchanged, that's not failure. That means you're the planter, and someone else is going to come and water it, and ideally, hopefully, prayerfully, God's going to reap that harvest. I hope I answered your question.
Great.
Yeah. Do not compromise. This is very important. You do not compromise. Sin is sin. I think that one of the mistakes the church makes is we compromise on sin. You do not compromise, but you confront sin with as much grace as truth.
That's great. Thank you very much. Our time is up and over. And Brandon, will you do us a favor? Will you pray for us as a church community? Would you pray for us as a city? And we will finish up. We will say goodnight.
I'm sorry. I have one more thing I need to do. This is messed up. I planned on doing this and I forgot to do it. I have reading assignments for you.
Okay. Fair enough.
Yeah. I have reading assignments for you. Do me a favor. Hold on just a moment. You benefit from me being in my office. So I can just, I don't have to just have to tell you, I can show you. So hold on just a moment.
Okay. It's a good time to check the chat.
Oh, here we go. All right. I have 5 books for you. I'm only going to give you 5.
Back in school again.
Right. Yeah, man. Oh, Kwame, you should have known. You should have known. I almost made a syllabus. Okay. Because reading is fundamental. I'm just telling you. So 6 books. Okay. So 2 of them are written by my pastor. I may be biased here. Okay. So one of them is entitled. Where's the camera? One of them is entitled "Let's Get to." Where's the line? Okay. It's written by Dr. Tony Evans, and it's entitled "Let's Get to Know Each Other." Let's get to know each other. Dr. Anthony T. Evans. And then he also wrote, this book is rather old. This book's probably 25 years old. And he also wrote a book entitled Oneness Embraced. Lots of shadow. There we go. Oneness Embraced by Dr. Anthony Evans. If you're going to pick one or the other, I would choose this one because this is the more up-to-date book. And then I think everyone should read Divided by Faith. This is a story of how the church got into the ethnic rift that we're in now, Divided by Faith.
And who wrote that?
There's 4 authors on this one, but the primary is Michael Emerson.
Okay.
Michael O. Emerson. And they wrote a sequel to it entitled United by Faith.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah, they didn't want to leave you hanging, so they wrote a sequel to it.
All right.
And then we have, this is written by Dr. Eric Mason, and this was entitled Woke Church. This one is going to be hard to get because after Michael, well, maybe not too hard because they're trying to fix that, but I talked to Eric about this the other day. He told me that the book sold out the day after George Floyd was killed. Amazon is trying to get copies
Ooh.
of it. He said every time something of that sort happens, the sales go through the roof. But this is Woke Church. It's written by Dr. Eric Mason.
Okay.
Those are all believers, okay? But if you want to get a history of how we got to where we are, this one was written by Ibram Kendi.
Yep.
And Ibram Kendi is a professor of history, and it's called Stamped from the Beginning. And I do not believe Dr. Kendi is a believer, but he's approaching this from the perspective of a historian. And he's addressing the how we got to the divided season that we're in right now.
Would you recommend Dr. Kendi's other book, Anti-Racism, on anti-racism?
Yes, I would. I would recommend that one. I'm a book guy, guys. I also would say that everyone, where is it? Everyone should, okay. All right. Okay, one more. This is the last one, I promise.
Okay.
Okay. Everyone should read Martin Luther King's Why We Can't Wait. In this book is a chapter entitled Letter from the Birmingham Jail. He wrote that book to the clergy in Alabama who took out a full-page ad criticizing his actions there in Birmingham. And he explained to them, essentially, in a nutshell, it's easy to say wait when you're not the one enduring the hardship and pain of waiting. It's one of the best. This is my philosophy on this issue in a nutshell.
Thank you for sharing. Thank you for teaching. Thank you for preaching. Thank you for informing and recommending those books for us. And most of all, thank you for just hanging out with us and having a casual conversation about something that we can not take casually. So,
yeah, thank you for having me. I appreciate this.
We got some Bluebell vanilla ice cream coming for you too. Whole gallon.
That's God's ice cream. That's gonna be in the kingdom. I'm telling you.
Bluebell ice cream. That's it. That's the ticket.
He converted.
I'm telling you.
Nice.
I believe that has the Bluebell is gonna have a role in why we call it heaven. It's the kingdom food. I'm telling you. Yes.
Nice.
All ice cream should have yellow number 5 in it.
All right, Brandon, will you pray for us?
I will do that.
Thank you, sir.
God, we thank you for this day. And even in the midst of hardship and pain and discontent and maybe even depression and despair, we rest in you. We do not know what tomorrow holds, but we know that you hold tomorrow. I am blessed, God, because as I said earlier, for the first time in my life, this topic is on the lips of so many people. It can be disheartening to preach the same message over and over again for 20 years, but it's just like you to, in the midst of a pandemic, have a video go viral when everyone's going to be at home to see it. And it changed the cultural ears so they hear a message regarding reconciliation and a gospel that comes to bear on moments of injustice. Let us not become so politically minded that we do this of our own prowess. Let our hearts lean into your kingdom and celebrate, worship you as our King, so that every step be assessed by asking, will this bring glory and honor and fame to my King? I thank you for this gathering. And I thank you for us being able to do it in this medium. As often as I can complain about it and find discontent, 100 years ago when the world had a pandemic, they did not have the means of getting together in this manner. This is a blessing from you. It is provision from you. It is an act of your grace. So we lean into you even here, God. And I thank you for all of the faces, all of the stories, all of the names, all of the callings, all the missions of those represented here. Let them go out as ambassadors for your kingdom and make your name known and famous in a world that desperately needs the perfect life, the sacrificial death, the affirming resurrection of your cross. In the matchless name of Jesus the Christ we pray. And all God's people said,
Amen.
amen. Amen.
Amen.
Thanks for having me. Let's do it. Let's do this again.
Yes, yes. And hopefully sometime soon we'll get to meet in person, and I'll either buy you ice cream or coffee for sure at the least. So.
Or you can buy me ice cream and coffee. Don't tell my wife I said that.
Okay.
All right.
All right.
All right. We'll talk to y'all later.
All right.
Thanks, Brandon. Thank you so much.
Thank you very
Well,
much.
thanks for having me.
Talk to you guys.